For a very long time, societies did not ask whether people who broke the law could be changed, healed, or understood, because the main concern was much simpler and much harsher. And that concern was survival of the group, not happiness of the individual, not fairness, not inner growth, but order, safety, and predictability. And in that older worldview, if someone repeatedly violated the rules that held society together, it made sense to remove them from the group, sometimes temporarily, sometimes permanently, and sometimes violently, because from the perspective of the collective, a single unstable or dangerous individual could threaten many lives, and so prisons, exile, and even the death penalty were not seen as moral failures, but as tools, much like fences around a village or walls around a city, meant to protect what was inside by keeping danger outside. In that model, which we might call the correction model, the goal was never to change the inner world of the offender, but simply to correct behavior through fear and consequence. And fear, whether we like it or not, is a very powerful teacher. Because when the cost of breaking rules is severe and immediate, many people do not need deep self-reflection to comply. They simply adjust their behavior, just as a child quickly learns not to touch a hot stove after being burned once, and countries like Singapore or China still lean heavily on this philosophy today, where strong punishment, strict enforcement, and clear boundaries create low crime rates and high social order, even if personal freedom or emotional understanding is limited. From this angle, the well-being of the group comes first, and the well-being of each individual, especially those who violated the rules, becomes secondary. And there is a certain brutal honesty to this approach, because it does not pretend that everyone can be saved, changed, or rehabilitated. It simply says that society's job is to protect itself, not to heal every wound. And in this system, long prison sentences, life imprisonment, or even execution are not about vengeance, but about separation, about removing chaos from the system so the rest of the system can function. But over time, especially in democratic societies like the United States, the UK, and parts of Europe, another idea began to grow quietly and then loudly, and that idea was that every individual life has value, even the life of someone who committed a crime, and that crime does not necessarily define the totality of a person. And this belief did not come from practicality alone, but from moral, philosophical, and constitutional principles, especially the idea that the state should not permanently destroy a human life if there is even a chance for growth, learning, or transformation. This gave rise to what we now call the rehabilitation model, where the goal of incarceration is no longer only separation, but also change. And suddenly prisons began offering education, vocational training, therapy, and access to books, computers, or digital tablets, not because society became naive, but because it began to believe that behavior is shaped by environment, trauma, opportunity, and skill, and that many people who commit crimes are not born criminals, but formed through neglect, abuse, poverty, addiction, or lack of guidance. And if those conditions can be addressed, perhaps the behavior can change. But here is where the deep conflict appears. Because correction and rehabilitation are built on very different philosophies, and when we try to run both at the same time, the system begins to contradict itself, almost like pressing the gas and the brake at the same time, because correction says, you must obey, or you will suffer, while rehabilitation says, you must be understood, supported, and helped to grow. And these two messages, when delivered together without clarity, confuse not only inmates, but also the staff who work inside these systems every day. Imagine for a moment how this plays out in everyday life. Imagine raising a child where one parent says, if you break the rules, you will be punished severely, while the other says, if you break the rules, we will sit down and explore your feelings. And if these messages are not coordinated, the child does not learn responsibility or self-reflection, but confusion, manipulation, or resentment, and the same dynamic unfolds inside correctional systems. When custody staff operate under a punishment-first mindset, while educational, medical, and mental health staff operate under a growth-oriented mindset, and instead of collaboration, tension emerges. In countries that prioritize group well-being over individual well-being, This tension is resolved by choosing correction over rehabilitation, and the message is clear. Rules exist for the survival of the many, and those who violate them accept the consequences, and change from within is not required for society to function. Compliance is enough, and fear, when applied consistently, can maintain order. And there is a certain efficiency to this, because it does not require deep psychological insight, long-term investment, or emotional labor from the state. But in societies like the United States, the situation is fundamentally different, because the Constitution itself places individual life on nearly equal footing with collective well-being, and this creates a moral obligation that cannot be ignored, because if every individual life matters, then even the life of someone who committed a crime deserves dignity, opportunity, and a chance for growth. And once you accept this principle, pure authoritarianism becomes incompatible with the system, because fear alone cannot produce genuine transformation, only compliance. Rehabilitation, by its nature, requires listening, trust, education, skill building, and time, and it assumes that people can change, not through force, but through insight, opportunity, and support. And this demands that staff working in the Department of Corrections are not just guards but educators, mentors, clinicians, and collaborators, and that they do not simply enforce rules but understand human behavior, trauma, addiction, and mental illness. And this is not easy work because it requires emotional intelligence, patience, and coordination across roles that historically were never designed to work together. When rehabilitation is done poorly, it looks like being soft on crime, because the structure, accountability, and clarity that correction provides are missing. And when correction is done without rehabilitation in a democratic society, it looks cruel, ineffective, and morally inconsistent, because people are punished without being given tools to change, and then released back into society unchanged, often worse than before. And this is why recidivism becomes so high, not because punishment failed, but because punishment alone was asked to do the job of transformation. The real challenge, especially in the United States, is that you cannot copy authoritarian systems without abandoning democratic values, and you cannot fully rehabilitate without investing deeply in collaboration, training, and clarity of purpose. And this means correctional staff, educators, therapists, and medical professionals must operate as a unified system rather than competing philosophies. And everyone must understand whether the goal is containment, transformation, or some clearly defined balance of both. At a deeper level, this debate is not really about prisons, but about how we see human nature itself. Because if you believe people are fundamentally dangerous and selfish, then fear and separation make sense. But if you believe people are shaped by conditions and capable of growth, then education and support become essential, and every society, whether it admits it or not, chooses a position on this spectrum. And perhaps the most honest answer is that both models are partially right, because not everyone can or will change, and some individuals do pose ongoing danger to society, while others, given the right support, can genuinely transform. And pretending one model fits all cases creates harm in both directions, either by endangering society or by destroying lives unnecessarily. So the question is not whether correction or rehabilitation is morally superior, but whether we are willing to be clear, honest, and consistent about what we are trying to achieve, and whether we are willing to invest in systems that match our values. Because a society that claims to value individual life must do the hard work of rehabilitation properly, and a society that prioritizes order must accept the moral cost of exclusion. And in the end, this mirrors a question each of us faces in our own lives. When someone harms us, breaks trust, or crosses boundaries, do we respond with punishment alone, or do we seek understanding, growth, and change? And the answer, as uncomfortable as it may be, is that context matters, clarity matters, and pretending there is one simple solution is often the most dangerous illusion of all. Thank you for watching. Please share and subscribe for more.